Thank you so much, Helen. I'm slightly regretting not wearing my Helen Bevan T-shirt, which I promise I will have next year for Copenhagen. So let's talk a bit about how the world is really changing and start with a sobering story. Think for a moment about the way in which Harvey Weinstein used his power. It was command and control, it was top down, it was on his terms. He could start and stop rumors, he could start and stop careers, he could start and stop movies. There was a survey done of the last 30 years at the Oscars, and in joint first place for the people who were thanked the most times from the stage of the Oscars was Harvey Weinstein and God. Think how different that power is to the power of the Me Too movement. So the Me Too movement, of course, begins with the activist Tarana Burke here, but then it surges around the world, and it's a type of power that is working very differently. It's made by many. Every woman who steps forward and adds her voice makes the whole story, makes the whole movement stronger. It's distributed. There's no central leader. And as it moves around the world, the Me Too movement itself starts to shift. So when it gets to Brazil, they'll tell you that it's stories of your first assault. When it gets to France, it becomes, and this is very French, denounce your pig. When it gets to Italy, it goes the same way. It just has gone through India, where it's taken on the Bollywood industry. It's a difference between the type of power. In the case of Harvey, it was a power that was a currency. He had it, you didn't. He spent it on his terms, not yours. And power as a current, something that flows and surges as it moves around the world. And of course, we see this in the health space. One of the inspiring stories we learned about recently was a story of a patient called Letitia. And her whole life, she had suffered from seizures. And they were so bad, these seizures, that she told us that she was worried for her wedding day, because she didn't think she'd get through her wedding day without having a seizure. And her doctor had always referred to them with her as space outs. They'd called them space outs. And this was America, of course, so they just medicated and medicated and medicated, and nothing was improving. So she went to learn about this, and one day she went in to see her doctor, and she said to her doctor, I think I know what's wrong. I have a secondarily generalized tonic-clonic. And her doctor fired her. Her doctor said, that's my language, not yours. I can't have you learning things like that. We're done. So she disappears. She goes onto the internet, and she finds this site. It's called Patients Like Me. And if you don't know, it's fascinating. It's now 600,000 patients who share their health data, their information, the stories of their treatment, stories of their lives with each other. They now cover over 2,000 diseases. So she goes on to Patients Like Me, and she finds a poll put together by a group of patients, which shows that 83% of those patients have had a particular kind of surgery and seen positive outcomes. She hunts down a new doctor, she has the surgery. 6 years later, she hasn't had a single seizure since, and she has become an advocate for other patients like her amongst this community. Interesting too, they've now published over 100 peer-reviewed surveys coming out of the data created by those patients. Story number 3 is a story of a local girl. This is Aqsa Mahmood from Glasgow. She went to school just miles from where we are in this room, and she was described as someone who was a good student. She loved Harry Potter. She went to good schools. They said that she was somebody who wouldn't be able to find her way to the center of Glasgow on the bus on her own. But in the evenings, she became a bedroom radical. She was radicalized by ISIS online. And one day, she just simply disappears. So this girl who couldn't find her way to the city center disappears, and a couple of days later, phones and calls her mother from the border heading into Syria to tell her mother that she's not coming home and she's joined ISIS. But then her story doesn't stop. She becomes one of the most effective recruiters ISIS has ever had. And when you look back over her social media accounts, many of which have been deleted now, what you see isn't stories of violence or gruesome beheadings. It's like any teenager's blog. It's hopeful. It has tips on makeup and moisturizer. It has emojis about how good life will be when you arrive. And she builds, and this is a sobering phrase, she builds a girl-to-girl network that recruits women and girls from all around the world to join her in Iraq and Syria. Now contrast that to the US government, who at the same time is trying to combat ISIS. And they do two things. The first thing they do is they fly bomber planes over Iraq and Syria, and they drop paper cartoons out of the back of the planes. And these paper cartoons show how bad life will be if you become a jihadi. This is 100 years old, this tactic, and of course fails miserably. So they embrace social media with this Twitter account, which scolds potential jihadis by saying, "Think again, turn away," helpfully in English, with the largest State Department logo they could find. Again, not super persuasive in terms of fighting the communications war against ISIS. So, three different stories, right? The story of a movement of women around the world who brought down scores, if not hundreds now, of powerful men. Story number two, the story of a patient who, rejected by the system, found her own way to solve some of her own problems, but also to support others. Story number three, the story of a schoolgirl, essentially with zero resources, who could out-message the US government with unlimited resources. And what's behind all these stories is what I would argue is behind all of our work together, which is the real shift of our times, which is really nothing to do with social media and not much to do with technology. What it's about is how we think about power. So the grounding idea in the work I've done with my colleague Jeremy Hymans is to say that we need to recognize a world of old power and the world of new power, and how they battle and how they balance. So think about old power for a moment, and think about kind of the stereotype of the doctor, right? So it's very much power is held by few, it commands, it downloads, it comes from on high, it's very closed up. It's power as a currency. But then think about how new power works. And new power is made by many. It uploads, it shares, it's peer-driven, it is open. To take a sobering idea from our world, if we think about the health world, think for a moment about the anti-vaccine movement, who is proving so effective. The anti-vaxxers are proving so effective for one reason, which is they have worked out how to use this new power. They have none of the expertise of the old power world, but they have all of the efficiency of spreading their message in a new power way. Here's a different way of thinking about the same power dynamics. Who knows this game? This is Tetris, the #1 game of the 20th century. And in a way, Tetris reflects how the old power world works, which is, it was a top-down game, somebody else set the rules, things fell down on our heads. Our only job was to make them fit into neat lines again and again and again, until eventually we collapsed under the pressure. Does anyone know who invented Tetris? This is my conspiracy theory. It was invented by the Russians. So it was owned by the Soviet government. So my conspiracy theory is it was created as a means of distracting the Americans during the Cold War. All right, so if the world used to work like Tetris, what game does the world work like now? This game. This game is Minecraft. Now, Minecraft is a block-based game, as is Tetris. They're both based on blocks. But Minecraft, the dynamics are very different. This here is a hospital built on Minecraft by patients. So people from all around the world come together. They co-create a world that has no rules. It is built from the bottom up. You can create anything you like in Minecraft on your terms, not on somebody else's. So as we think about the worlds we are wrestling with, what we're really seeing in the world is a generation of people who expected the world to work like Tetris, conflicting with a generation of people who expect the world to work like Minecraft. And we tried to sum that up by outlining two mindsets. The first is the old power mindset, and the second is the new power mindset. So the old power world, the way that old power thought about the world was very much about confidentiality, about discretion, about expertise, about long-term affiliation. We built many of the worlds in this room on old power. But the new power mindset, that Minecraft mindset, expects something different of the world. They expect much more transparency. They expect to do things on their terms, not on yours. There's much shorter term conditional affiliation. We're seeing these surges of new power happen again and again around the world, which surge up and then disappear. In the US, the 3 biggest protests in modern history have been in the last 3 years. So as you think about your world, think about this old power mindset and this new power mindset, and let me underline something which I think is perhaps the most important argument I want to make to you today. My argument today is not old power is bad and new power is good. In fact, especially in this room, you think about the importance of evidence, of empiricism, of science, of peer review, of expertise in all the forms we know it. That couldn't be more important in a world gone mad. In fact, I'll give you a personal example, and this is a moment of radical transparency. Last year, I had my appendix out. This is actually the right crowd to talk about this. Last year, I had my appendix out, and I can promise you now, the last thing in the world I would ever want would be a new power appendectomy. The idea that a group of hipsters from Hoxton could, on the weekends, go onto Reddit and work out how to take out my appendix. What of course you want in moments like those is Dr. Chu, who has been doing this for 15 years. So a serious point, one of the most important things in our world right now is we are desperate for old power. We need expertise, we need professionalism, we need systems and structures and institutions to work. But the problem in the world right now is people are seeing this as too much of a binary. The old power world is rejecting and holding off the new power world rather than working out how they can enter it and help it make sense. So we started to do this work in Harvard Business Review, and one of the things that always happens if you want to write for Harvard Business Review is you're legally obliged to create some kind of 2x2 matrix, otherwise they never publish you. So I wanted to share this with you, and then I'm going to ask you to do a quick exercise. What we tried to then say was, okay, if you buy this idea that there are 2 dimensions of our world, one is your model. Do you have an old power model or a new power model? So is your model like Tetris, where you're dropping things down on people's heads, or is your model like Minecraft, where you're creating this space for collaboration? And then do you have old power values or new power values? Do you believe in expertise and managerialism and confidentiality? Or do you believe in transparency and the wisdom of the crowd? So with those 2 different axes, we've kind of plotted out 4 areas. The first in the bottom left is the castles. Old power meets old power. So think about the Encyclopedia Britannica. Think about the Nobel Prize, right? Small group of experts decide who the smartest physicist in the world is, hands out a prize each year. It's a very old power idea. But what we're beginning to see is the emergence in this bottom right of what we call cheerleaders. These are organizations who have old power models, but increasingly have new power values. So think about, for example, The Guardian. So The Guardian's hundreds of years old, but as you read an article on The Guardian, you'll be encouraged halfway through, if it's about climate science, to sign a petition. The Guardian now is treating all of its readers as members. They see them as people who support their mission in meaningful ways. The Guardian now, in the US, have a database of police killings, which is put together by their readers. So they're still an old power model, but they're beginning to enter these new power values. In the top right, you see what we call the crowds. This is where new power meets new power. So think about Me Too or Occupy or Black Lives Matter at the extreme, these social movements that are defining our times. But think too about something like Patients Like Me that I just mentioned. So Patients Like Me, its model is new power, right? It's got 600,000 patients, it has made a community, but its values are new power too. It's trying to rely upon the wisdom and the transparency of the crowd. And then finally in the top left, perhaps the most interesting quadrant, is what we call the co-opters. These are organizations with new power models, but old power values. So take Facebook for a second. Facebook has the best new power model we've ever seen, right? Billions of us are taking part every day, yet the values of Facebook are very old power. It's closed up. The algorithm makes decisions about all of us. We don't understand them. The governance is shrouded and held by a very small number of people. And interestingly, the organizations in this quadrant in recent years have seen a lot of pressure coming on to them as the dissonance between their model and their values is being played out in public. So I'm not going to have 45 minutes with you and just talk at you. Here is your first exercise. Please meet the person next to you if you don't know them. Introduce yourself so we get to know each other. And for the next 3 minutes, I'd like you to answer 2 questions for me. thinking about your organization, the organization you work for now, or your bit of the organization, whichever you prefer, thinking about your organization right now, where are you on this 2x2 grid? And where should you be, not where will you be, where should you be in 5 years' time? So I'm looking if you identify two quadrants. Which quadrant are you in now? And which quadrant should you be in 5 years' time? We'll spend 3 minutes meeting our neighbor on that topic. All right. All right, everybody. If we could come back to order. This is the time that old power's better. Please be quiet. I'm not going to crowdsource that. All right. So that was an old power whistle for me. Thank you. All right. Can we have some house lights? We're going to do a quick poll of the room. All right. So let's begin. Thinking about right now, your organization right now, who right now thinks of themselves as a crowd, top right? All right, so I'm going to go for less than 1%. Who here, do we have any brave co-opters in the room? Does anyone here who sees themselves as a co-opter? We have, all right, this is good, we're getting there. We've got some very brave co-opters in the room. You're welcome. Who here sees themselves now as a cheerleader? Okay, we're getting there, it's going viral. 15%. And who now sees themselves as a castle? All right, we're getting there. Right, so my unscientific survey puts 85% of us as castles and 15% of us generously at cheerleaders. Let's go forward 5 years. In 5 years' time, who wants to stay in the same spot? Who thinks they should stay just where they are in 5 years' time? Half a hand. Half a hand, so, which I think with a room this size is statistically insignificant, which means all of us, interesting thought, every single person in this room from all the different backgrounds you have in the next 5 years think you need to make a change. And I think so too. And what I want to talk about for the rest of this session is some ways of thinking about how you make that change. And I want to start with a story which comes from an organization in the US, which was NASA. So NASA was under a lot of criticism. They were seen as not very innovative, and their funding was going to be cut. So they had this idea. They thought, well, we want to experiment with open innovation. So open innovation is this idea where you invite the crowd to help solve your problems. So NASA listed out 9 of their problems, and they put it out to the world, and they were overwhelmed by the quality of responses they got from the crowd, including, most interestingly, this problem in heliophysics. So in heliophysics, sunstorms fly through space. They are best avoided if you are in the mode of space travel. The best algorithm NASA had predicted these about an hour and a half before they happened, and they got it right 50% of the time. A retired engineer from his shed sent in an algorithm that predicted this 8 hours ahead with 75% accuracy. Everyone was, and his wasn't the only one, they were actually overwhelmed by the quality and frequency of suggestions they got from all over the world. So they had a big meeting like this, and the chief scientist came to the front and said, we are going to break new ground in open innovation. We are going to open up NASA to the crowd. We are going to work out new ways of solving our problems. And that meeting he was in went horribly, horribly wrong. There was this schism at NASA, and 2 groups of people emerged at NASA. And what started to happen, this work went on for a number of years. The first group of people did everything they could to keep the crowd out of NASA. They tried their very hardest to keep the crowd out. They gave the crowd bad information. They sometimes gave the crowd false information to stop them from winning. They sometimes denied they were taking part in these experiments at all. Another group embraced every piece of this. They changed their jobs, they changed their titles, they found new ways to engage the crowd, they shifted the dynamics of the workplace to get more value to the crowd. What's interesting about these 2 groups is there was no difference in age, there was no difference in demographics, there was no difference in technology. I mean, these were literally all rocket scientists. Yet there were 2 very different responses to the idea that the crowd was going to enter NASA. And so here's your question for the next minute with your other neighbor, please. What's happening? Why are there 2 such different responses to the crowd entering NASA? 1 minute with your other neighbor on what is happening here at NASA. All right, so who is feeling brave? Will someone shout out? Do we have a thesis? Anyone want to shout out an idea of what's happening here? Fear to give up power? A fear of uncertainty, fear of giving up power. One more? Loss, terrific, loss, attack on experience. So the scientist who was inside, the researcher, who was inside NASA for these years, it's her study this comes from, she's called Hila Lifshif Asaf at New York University. She had this breakdown. Her analysis was this. She was inside the NASA and did all of this work. She said that there are 2 types of people who emerged at NASA, and it's not about technology or about social media, it's all about professional identity. How we think about our professional identity. And so she said there were 2 groups. One were the problem solvers, and the other were the solution seekers. And so the problem solvers saw experts as the answer. They always relied upon organizational process. They had this idea of high control. She was telling me that anytime she would go and talk to some of the problem seekers about the crowd, they would immediately start listing off their degrees. She never asked them about their degrees. The solution seekers are people who think about the world differently. They think about anyone being the answer. They think about distributed control process. They think about low control. And in the words of one of the scientists, as she was arguing with her colleagues, she said to them, we have to stop thinking the world is my lab and start thinking the lab is my world. So as you think about your own work, one of the interesting questions is, who in the world are the problem solvers and who are the solution seekers? How are you thinking about those people, what roles they play in your world, and why? I want to shift now to talk about how you deal with some of these changes, and to tell a story briefly that will be familiar to some of you here in the room, but not familiar to some of you from other countries, which was an organization in the UK who were trying to get their head around new power. So this is the National Environment Research Council in the UK. They had this new boat here. This was their new Arctic Explorer boat. And they had the idea they wanted to engage the crowd in helping to name the boat. So they started a campaign called #NameOurShip, and they issued a press release. The first sign that this campaign may not go well was there are not many social media campaigns that begin with press releases. But they issue a press release that says #NameOurShip, and they say, we would like to invite you, the public, the British public, to name this ship. Perhaps you would like to call it Adventurer, or Endeavour, or Shackleton. Those were the three ideas that they had. That, as many of us know, was not what happened. By some great distance, the runaway success was Royal Research Ship RRS Boaty McBoatface. Although I do want to draw attention to, I think, the overlooked 10th place suggestion, I like big boats and I cannot lie. So this campaign goes amazingly well. It goes viral, it trends #1 on Twitter, it's covered by international press, it is the talk of the nation, it's the talk of countries all around the world, so much so as the man who suggested this is forced into an apology. So he has to apologize to the government, then the crowd turns on him for apologizing. He then retracts his apology the next day and stands by Boaty McBoatface. So I want you all to imagine yourselves in the shoes of this poor government agency, stuck between what I'm going to argue are the two forces of our time, right? On one hand, you have the science minister, who is taking this very seriously and says, look, you simply cannot spend 300 million pounds of taxpayers' money on Boaty McBoatface. Make this go away. Old power here. Over here you have new power, which is the fine people of the United Kingdom and the world have decided that this ought to be launched immediately, and they'd like to see Boaty McBoatface win this contest. So you have 1 minute, probably half a minute, 1 minute with your neighbor, which is, I want you to work out this. You have to decide, are you going to keep this name and go with new power, or are you going to abandon this name and go with your boss? 30 seconds to work out your answer, and we'll do a quick check of the room. All right, house lights, please. The Times is on the phone. They've called you up. Are you keeping the name or are you changing? Let's do a quick poll of the room to sense whether old power or new power is the four of this room. Who would keep the name? Who is going to keep the name? Bravo. You've delighted the public but lost your jobs. Who would change the name? All right, interesting. So what they, of course, do in reality is they name the submarine on the side of this boat, Boaty McBoatface. They call the boat Sir David Attenborough so no one can complain. So the sad end of this story is Boaty is sunk at sea. This, of course, ends up with a parliamentary inquiry. And there's a very funny moment. The chief executive of NERC brings an expert out to defend this campaign. And the expert is doing quite a good job of defending this campaign and eventually is asked whether he had participated in the Name Our Ship campaign. To which he says yes. And then says very quietly, and they ask him who he voted for, and voted for Burford. It is a fun story, but it points towards a serious set of questions I would encourage us to think about as practitioners, right? Which is, our argument today is not new power is perfect, or you should use it all the time, or it should replace old power. Our argument today is there are a series of ways we need to think about new power that when we do use it, we can use it in very meaningful ways. So 4 questions I'd encourage us to ask ourselves. Question number 1 is strategy. Do you need the crowd? Do the crowd need you? Are you really doing work here that you want the crowd to be involved in, or is this stage management? For NERC, they didn't need any help with this. They just wanted everyone to agree with their idea. Number 2 is legitimacy. Do you have legitimacy when you're entering these spaces that people will engage with you as you start to build new power? There was a campaign in the US that JP Morgan, the bank, ran after the financial crisis called #AskJPM. And what they thought would happen is people would ask questions like, how do I get a career in banking? And can you explain what a derivative swap is? And of course, the questions were, how do you sleep at night? And how do you feel about having brought down global capitalism? So if you're going to enter the world, do you have legitimacy? Thirdly, most importantly for this group is control. We often think with new power, we have to give up control. We position the world as it's either you have complete control or complete chaos. That is false. You need to think differently about how you release some control, how you create space for participation, but that isn't the same thing as embracing anarchy. And then finally, commitment. One thing we see time and again is, do you do this work day after day after day after day? One of the reasons we admire Helen and her team so much is this is a muscle they are building every single day of the year to strengthen the system. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about something practical around how you can spread your ideas in the new power world, because one of the things we're all trying to do now, right, is mobilize people around our ideas. And here's an example of a company getting it quite wrong, and then one getting it quite right. So does everyone remember this? You may not. There was an advert. This is for Pepsi. This was the height of Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement, and they created this very highly polished TV commercial, which they rolled out, of the most attractive-looking protest you've ever seen in your life, of people holding signs that say things like, "We are a movement." Those of you who have been to protests will recognize 2 things. 1, there is a fair distribution of attractiveness at protests in general. And 2, no one holds up a sign which says, "We are a movement." So the basic story of this advert is she goes into this tense moment of standoff between police and people, and thankfully Kendall Jenner, one of the Kardashians, arrives, and she walks forward and hands a can of Pepsi to the white police officer, and of course the protest comes to an end. This leads to a huge backlash around the world. Every activist around the world feels dumb. We know all it takes is Kendall Jenner and a Pepsi to fix things. Even better than that was this one. This goes so badly that Pepsi has to pull the campaign and very weirdly apologizes to Kendall Jenner, of all people. So that's the Pepsi campaign. Of course, Pepsi's great rival is Coke. Here's a story I learned about last year in Brazil. And so Coke in Brazil, there's a phrase in Brazil which is, "That Coke is a Fanta." And it's a homophobic slur. And it's obviously been detested by the homosexual community and all right-minded people for years. And it was a problem for Coke, because Coke owned both Coke and Fanta. So anytime people said, "This Coke is a Fanta," it became a big issue for them. So they created this can of Coke, and it says on it, "This Coke is a Fanta, so what?" And inside the Coke was Fanta. And then they did nothing. They stepped back and they did nothing. And what was so interesting, they put this product in the stores and they walked away from it. And they had this huge amount of media coverage around the campaign and what was happening. But most interestingly, people started to take this campaign and make it their own. So people started to buy Coke, tip it out, tip in Fanta. People started to be very creative around what this campaign was and how it grew. And it became the most organic campaign of the whole year in Brazil. This was a T-shirt. I was talking to a woman last year. This is a T-shirt created not by Coke, but by someone in the Coke universe, someone part of this campaign, started selling it on the internet. She told me she bought this T-shirt for her son because he had just come out. That campaign, $0 investment, 1 billion media impressions, the most viral campaign of the year. And the reason for that is it did the 3 things I would encourage you all to do when you think about your own ideas. And that's the reason I use these examples, not because I wanted to come to a health conference and do an advertisement for sugary drinks. So if you think about what's happening here, if you want your ideas to spread, they need to have these three characteristics. 1 is actionable, 2 is connected, 3 is extensible. Actionable, you're asking people to do something, right? In the case of this coat, you're buying the coat, you're making things around it. Connected, you're tying yourself to other people who are in your world. You feel like you're part of a worldview by participating. And then 3, most importantly, extensible. It's an idea you can take and you can turn it into something else. Think about the Me Too movement too. The Me Too movement is an action, Me Too. It's connected, it ties you to other women around the world. It's extensible, that movement can change and adapt. And one of the stories that I've been inspired by in this community is the story of End PJ Paralysis. So this is a campaign to, I think many of you will know this well, but it's a campaign to get people up and about and out of their pajamas, which begins with a conversation on Twitter with a nurse, but then people throughout this room and around the world start to take this idea and build on it and make it stronger. So it's actionable, you're trying to end PJ paralysis, it's connected, it ties you to health professionals and patients around the world, and it's extensible. As it develops and goes into every ward and every hospital, it starts to change to reflect the individual conditions. So you see things like this big campaign now over last summer to have 1 million patients' days saved. I think they've got to about 700,000. You see things like this. This is a Spotify playlist created by somebody to help encourage end PJ paralysis, including Get Up, Stand Up, that I thought was good, and we don't have to take our clothes off. And even here in Scotland, you see campaigns like this one, which take local flavor and bring them to the campaign. Of course, this is a fun idea, but it leads to real results. So what's been interesting with this campaign is you've seen outcomes around length of stay improving. You've seen things like pressure ulcers improving. And Brian Dolan, who was behind the launch of this campaign, although of course now he's one of so many, he said this, which I thought was an interesting leadership lesson for us all as we think about change management. He said, "While I may have originated the term, I'm keen to stress I don't own it. My rationale is that no one owns it, we can all own it, and no one needs permission to do with it as they will." And just in the last 24 hours, I scraped this from Twitter today or yesterday, you're seeing all around the world this idea beginning to keep pushing action, to keep changing, and to keep moving all the way around the world. And you can participate this very summer. There is going to be a whole summit around NPJ paralysis where you can learn from people taking part, and they'll be encouraging people around the world to play a part in this movement. The reason these ideas are working is the way your ideas can work too, is that they do these 3 things. They force an action, they make people feel connected, and you leave enough room for people to take part in your mission on their terms. I want to say that twice. Take part in your mission on their terms. The old power world, we wanted people to participate on our mission on our terms. In the new power world, the great skill is leaving that space. I want to finish with 3 broad implications, I think, for the sector here about how we think about the future. The first is this, that we're entering a time, for good or for ill, where intensity is mattering more than favorability. So anything which is breaking through right now isn't the kind of vanilla, please eat your vegetables messaging we've relied upon for years. It's things that surge people around an issue or a moment. Whether that will lead to a better world is I think, a point out for debate. But as you think about how you're spreading your own ideas, remember you need to build ACE ideas. The reason ACE ideas matter is that's the route you need to use to get to intensity, to get people really mobilized around your idea. And that means something else as well, which is you need to get used to the idea of things changing outside your control. We hear a lot of talk. We hear a lot of talk at the moment. What? Did I get cut? Did I say something controversial? Have Pepsi sent some kind of writ? All right, so if you can't mobilize people unless you can work out ways to make it about them, not about you. We hear a lot of talk about movements in the world. Everyone is talking about building a movement. But it is only a movement if it moves without you. It's only a movement if other people start taking it somewhere that you didn't intend. Implication number 2, most important. This is not old power versus new power. That's not the right prescription. It's old power and new power. The biggest call to action I'd have for this room is to recognize just how important old power is, just how important new power is, and your great challenge for the years ahead is how you blend these together in meaningful ways. And the reason that matters so much doesn't just matter for the work that we all do, it matters because it's the kind of world we will end up building together. And by way of a conclusion, I think if you're looking for one big message I would want to leave you with today, is the future is a battle for mobilization, right? Whoever mobilizes best is going to win, and the question of our times is who will that be? Will it be this, again, delightfully attractive group of health professionals here on the left, or will it be the anti-vaxxers? Will it be the climate scientists, or will it be the climate deniers? Will it be the crazies on the internet, or will it be the voices of reason? The question of our times is whoever works out new power best is who's going to end up winning. And the one thing I was most inspired by today as I was looking at the posters that you have just down in hall number 4 is the mobilization that I think the world needs is being done by the people in this room. If you think about power shifting down and out into the world, the work that you are doing is the work that the world needs. I read about a story is about dementia patients from the University of Dundee, where people are working out new ways of engaging dementia patients so their voices are heard. I heard about the NHS Grampian, who have actually opened up their governance structures so as that more staff can be involved and feel that they are owners. I learned about Denmark, where 18 municipalities have come together to share data across all markets to improve health outcomes. I learned about Wigan, where a network has come together to help teachers learn how to teach CPR. I learned about Chicago, where an e-advisor network of patients and families has been built, so families themselves can help co-create the services that they need. And I learned about the NHS in Tayside and the Scottish Prison Service. It's hard to think of anything more old power than prison. Even there, people are working out ways to treat prisoners as partners in their health journeys, bringing them into a process as though they engage. So as I think about the future of this battle, the front line of this battle for mobilization are the people in this room. And when you see a snapshot of the innovation that I see on the posters in the room down the road, down the hallway, I think the future is very bright. I want to finish by making sure you know who I am. So there I am, and in a moment of radical transparency, there is my book. You know the rest. It's a great privilege to be with you all today. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for all you do.